Hello, welcome back to Key Philosophies. Today we continue with Matrix 3, Psychosocial Chemical Electromagnetic Manipulation of Human Consciousness. I think I left out chemical. Now we're on Chapter 7. We skipped a little bit that had to do with medical stuff that we're not allowed to talk about recently. We might do that on a Rumble or another station of some kind. Now, the electronic manipulation of populations. There are two main aspects of the electromagnetic manipulation of human beings that need to be reviewed. The first one is the development of man-made electromagnetic fields and the effect on human beings. The second is the development of electromagnetic methodology for the deliberate control of the physiological, psychological, and behavioral functions of human beings. Mind control. We will discuss the research that reflects advanced mind control applications that has been done since the publication of Matrix 2. Be sure that you have read the information in previous chapters. Man-made electromagnetic fields and their effects. The supplementary electromagnetic fields that were superimposed over the already existing natural electromagnetic phenomena begin in the late 19th century. By 1882, Thomas Edison had set up the first generating station in the United States, transmitting low-voltage direct current DC to downtown New York. Around the same time period, Tesla developed the alternating current AC system, which was capable of transmitting greater power over longer distances. By 1894, Tesla's generators at Niagara Falls were in operation. By 1898, AC transmission lines 75 miles in length were in use in California. In 1890, Heinrich Hertz discovered that a spark gap would produce a spark at a similar gap a few feet away without being connected. Hertz would later be involved with several other scientists in rewriting of Maxwell's equations, an action that would severely limit human and scientific progress in physics and electronics thereafter. In 1901, Marconi transmitted the letter S across the Atlantic Ocean, followed by radio transmissions. In 1918, from England to Australia. By the late 1920s, commercial radio transmission had become commonplace, and electric power of up to 200,000 volts was being transmitted over hundreds of miles by means of Tesla's technology. Since World War II, it is estimated that electric power and communication systems have been growing at between 5 and 10% per year. New technologies have appeared, which include cellular telephone networks and satellite relay stations. In short, the human population has been overwhelmed with a profusion of electromagnetic smog. Before 1900, the electromagnetic field of the Earth was composed of the GMF and its associated micropulsations, visible light, and random discharges of lightning. What was not realized by the majority of people was that the exposure of living organisms to abnormal electromagnetic fields results in significant abnormalities, both in physiology and behavior. Electrical power systems operate at 50 to 60 cycles per second, just above the highest naturally occurring frequency of 30 cycles per second. Microwave systems operate at billions of cycles per second and are rapidly getting closer to the trillion cycle frequencies of visible light. The previously empty electromagnetic spectrum between these two extremes was filled with man-made radiation in less than 80 years. When man began to make use of the electromagnetic spectrum, it was recognized that it could be generally divided into two areas: frequencies below those of visible light, lacked the power to produce ionization of the chemical structures of the body and were called non-ionizing radiation. Frequencies higher than visible light contained enough energy to damage physical organisms. Ionizing radiation caused the formation of free radicals within an organism and other damaging effects. Because non-ionizing radiation appeared to lack the ability to produce these effects, it was assumed that it had no biological effect. In fact, it was assumed that any biological effect that was not the result of ionization was the result of heat. Since it was discovered that frequencies of about 27 million cycles, 27 megahertz, and higher produce heating of tissues. The dividing line for the production of heating effects was set at 27 megahertz. In 1953, John McLaughlin, a medical officer for the Hughes Aircraft Corporation, identified cases of unexplained bleeding, leukemia, and brain tumors among workers exposed to low-strength microwaves. Since most of the Hughes contracts were military contracts, it turned the problem over to the military. In 1955, the British journal Nature reported that a short exposure to pulsed 27 megahertz radio signals produced abnormalities in the cells of the growing root tips of plants. It was the same frequency, 27 megahertz, that had been assigned to the medical profession for use in radio wave therapy. The study was ruthlessly criticized. Within 10 years, other researchers reported the same results at the FDA. Others reported finding the same effects at non-thermal levels. The creation of safety standards. In 1950s, the Department of Defense recognized the necessity for adoption of some sort of standard for the exposure to microwaves. This led directly to the establishment of the Tri-Service Program, which was based at the Rome Airport Development Center in Rome, New York, and given the task of determining this standard. Reports of non-thermal effects were pretty much ignored despite their obvious implications, and the military continued to dominate the field for their view that ionizing radiation was the only dangerous radiation and that there were no biological effects other than thermal effects. However, some safety standard had to be developed for the thermal effects. On the basis of theoretical calculations, it was postulated that microwave exposure at 100 milliwatts to an area of 1 square centimeter of body surface would exceed the ability of the blood circulatory system to carry away the heat produced, and local tissue heating would occur. By 1957, the military adopted a standard for exposure to microwaves of 100 milliwatts per square centimeter. In 1966, the American National Standards Institute adopted the same standard for recommended civilian exposure for occupational purposes. This is all that is generally known by most people about the creation of the ANSI standard for exposure of 10 milliwatts per square centimeter. A little more digging, however, revealed a little more of the covert aspects behind the development of this so-called standard. A generally proposed 10 milliwatt per square centimeter EMR exposure limit was done under the Tri-Service Program based on the work of Professor Hermann P. Schwann, a former Nazi scientist who entered the United States in 1947 under Project Paperclip. Schwann created a model in 1953 using metal balls and flasks of salt to simulate the human body. With little debate or experimentation, industry and military accepted the results of Schwann's experiments as representing a true picture of thermal effects. Adoption of the standard by ANSI is remarkable since Schwann consistently maintained that his dosage limit was safe for probably no more than an hour. And here you have Becker, R.O., and Selden, G., 1985, The Body Electric in New York, Morrow, Scheifel, Bynes, in 1974, The Invisible Threat, The Stifled Story of Electric Waves. Those are some of your references there. There were persuasive economic reasons why the 10,000 microwatt standard was and still is defended at all costs. Lowering it would have curtailed the expansion of military electromagnetic research and cut into the profits of the corporations that supplied the hardware. A reduced standard that was safe would constitute an admission that the old one was unsafe, leading to liability for damage claims from XGIs and industrial workers. One of the strongest monetary reasons was given in a 1975 classified summary of the Department of Defense Tri-Surface Electromagnetic Radiation Bioeffects Research Plan. Lower standards will significantly restrict the military use of EMR in a peacetime environment and require the procurement of substantial real estate around ground-based EMR emitters to provide buffer zones. The needed real estate was estimated at that time to be 498,000 acres. The price of the land would surely run into the billions of dollars. In 1982, ANSI reviewed the original 10 milliwatt per square centimeter standard and revised it in light of new knowledge. This time, great attention was paid to the theoretical relationship between the wavelength of a radio signal and the length of the human body. If we say that the average human body is 6 feet in length, then the frequency range of 80 to 100 megahertz would overlap both above and below 6 feet. This frequency just happens to overlap the 88 to 108 megahertz FM frequency band. Again, with nothing more than theory, ANSI adopted a new standard that was frequency dependent but was still based on thermal effects. In 1984, the Environmental Protection Agency was on the point of proposing a standard of 1,000 UWatt per square centimeter, but was forced to back down under pressure from its own policy office. In 1988, the EPA announced that it was postponing its decision indefinitely. According to Microwave News, September-October 1988. Even if the ANSI, which is composed of key researchers for industry and military, adopted a standard which was designed to limit exposure to reasonable levels, the ANSI standards are recommendations, not provisions that are enforceable. There exists no enforceable standard in the U.S. for limitation of electromagnetic radiation. Some states have adopted certain limitations through their legislatures, but those limitations are within ANSI guidelines. It's sort of like asking the fox to guard the henhouse. Despite the denial of the military and the government of biological effects from non-ionizing radiation, in 1974, the Office of Naval Research began collecting published scientific reports from around the world in the general area of biological effects of non-ionizing radiation and publishing abstracts as a digest. This digest is still being published, well, at least as of the release of this book. The University of Washington study. Dr. Arthur Guy, a former consultant for ANSI, participated in a $5 million study at the University of Washington that was funded by the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine in early 1980s. It was a $5 million study that backfired. A study was to determine if there were potential hazards in the human being from chronic exposure to microwave radiation. In the study, Guy used notobiotic rats, meaning that they were considered germ and virus free. This fact alone was one of the reasons for the excessive costs. All of the animals used, both experimental and control animals, were notobiotic. In this study, rats were continuously exposed to high frequency microwaves of 2.45 gigahertz, billions of hertz, at a field strength of zero point 0.5 milliwatt per square centimeter, 20 times lower than the safety thermal level. 150 times 50 measurements of the health and behavior were collected. According to Guy, there were primary malignant tumors that developed in 18 of the exposed animals, but in only 5 of the controls. Guy made the attempt to get around the results of the test by saying that the results were not statistically significant or came and went, suggesting that they may be due to chance. The use of germ-free animals in the experiment would seem odd because we live in a world surrounded by organisms. An experiment on germ and virus-free animals has no relevance to the real world. Present evidence seems to indicate that at least 20% of human cancers are caused by viral infection, and this percentage appears to be even higher in animals. Therefore, animals that are maintained to be gnotobiotic should have an incidence of cancer that is much lower than expected. It is also well established that exposure to any abnormal electromagnetic field produces a stress response. If the exposure is prolonged, the stress response system becomes exhausted and the competency of the immune system declines to below normal. In such a state, animals and humans are more susceptible to cancer and infectious disease. One can only conclude that the experiment was deliberately designed to sharply reduce the incidence of cancer and infectious disease in the exposed animals. There can be no other reason for the requirement that the animals be notobiotic. In Guy's study, the fact that the experimental animals had a lower than normal incidence of cancer was totally expected. What was unexpected by Guy was that even with this protection, the cancer incidence in the animals exposed to the microwaves was 4 times that in the control animal. The well-designed experiment that should have proved that microwaves are safe fell into its own trap, and the nature of the trap is revealed by the types of cancer that occurred in the experimental group. These were mainly limited to cancers of the pituitary, thyroid, and adrenal glands. The experiment was designed to prevent the results of stress. But the planners forgot that it would produce stress, because stress resistance is connected with the glands just mentioned. We must conclude that microwave exposure produced in an extremely high level of stress. Well, that microwave exposure produced an extremely high level of stress. If the animals had been normal instead of germ-free, they would have died long before the close of the experiment. This project was reported in the July-August 1984 issue of Microwave News. Microwave and genetic effects. In 1983, studies by the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health reported that sperm production in male mice exposed to non-thermal levels of microwave radiation decreased and was accompanied by significant abnormal changes in the structure of the chromosomes of the sperm. Researchers E. Manakowski, P. Zerska, and L. Leach concluded that chromosomal abnormalities were produced by microwave exposure at dose rates far below those producing a heating effect. They noted that the mechanism appeared to be a direct effect of microwaves on the chromosomes themselves. In a recent study, doctors at Boston Brigham and Women's Hospital surveyed 69,277 newborn infants and identified infants with major developmental malformations. Some of these had no family history of problems, and the malformations appeared to be the result of spontaneous mutations. The infants were born during the years 1972 and 75, 79, and 85. It appeared that at this time that at least 39% of genetic developmental defects in human infants are the result of some external cause. Vernon, New Jersey is a small town of about 25,000, but it is fifth in the nation for the number of microwave transmitters. The incidence of Down syndrome cases in Vernon is 1,000 times above the national average. A possible explanation for the production of genetic effects by microwaves is that the wavelength of the microwave radiation may be small enough to have a resonant effect on the DNA molecule or the chromosomes. In 1988, Dr. Reba Goodman reported at a meeting of the Bioelectromagnetics Society that the effects appeared to be different for different frequencies, and that they also differ depending on the type of cell exposed. Both ELF and microwave radiation have the capability to influence genetic material during the process of cell division. There are even indications that DC fields can influence mitosis and chromosomal patterns. Microwaves and brain tumors. During the years between 1940 and 1977, there was an unprecedented increase in the use of microwaves. During that same period, the incidence of primary brain tumors rose between 1.7 to 2 point per or 2 per 100,000 people. ELF radiation from power lines. While only a portion of the population is exposed to microwave radiation, most of the population is exposed to 60 Hz fields given off by the electrical web that surrounds the population. The 60 Hz electrical power frequency lies within the band termed extremely low frequency, ELF, which covers the region from 0 DC to 100 Hz. It was formerly considered impossible for an ELF field to have any biological effect. The wavelengths average about 3,000 miles. These ELF fields, however, have some interesting properties. They may be transmitted over great distances through the ionospheric cavity, a factor that played a part in Project Sanguine. This project was instituted by the Navy, using huge antenna arrays designed to operate at either 45 Hz or 70 Hz in order to have communication with the submarine fleet as far away as the Indian Ocean. A large antenna was constructed at Clem Lake in Wisconsin, and studies were done to gauge the effects on nearby humans. A study that was completed in 1973. It was found that one day exposure to the field produced a significant increase in the serum triglyceride levels in 90% of the people studied. Serum triglyceride levels are increased by the stress response and are related to fat and cholesterol metabolism. The power field strength from Project Sanguine was a million times smaller than that of the field produced by the ultra-high voltage 275 kVA and above transmission lines that crisscrossed the country. After the meeting to discuss the results, the Navy denied that the meeting ever had taken place and insisted that it had no knowledge of any scientific studies indicating possible harm to human beings from the operation of the Sanguine system. The results of chronic exposure to 60 Hz electric fields are many. British studies are far more numerous and more widely published than American studies. Dr. Stephen Perry who worked for the British National Health Service as a family practice physician in a rural area of England, reported that he had observed that his patients who lived near electrical lines appeared to have a higher incidence of mental disturbances and suicide. This was not well received by various authorities. There were subsequent epidemiological studies which confirmed the data, and the findings were published in 1976. A second study was published in 79. Dr. Nancy Wertheimer, a epidemiologist at the University of Colorado, was examining the possible relationship between the magnetic field from electrical lines, not the high voltage lines we previously discussed, but secondary lines that are strung everywhere. She made a startling discovery: 60 hertz magnetic fields with strengths of only 3 milligauss, 3,000ths of a Gauss. The Earth's magnetic field averages a zero point 0.5 Gauss, were statistically related to the incidence of childhood cancers. This field strength is many times smaller, as mentioned above, than the Earth's normal magnetic field, and it is far below the average strength of 100 milligauss at a distance of approximately 50 feet from the standard transmission line. Wertheimer published her data in 79. Her paper was immediately subjected to bitter criticism solely on the disbelief that it could be true. New York State did a study of power lines costing $500,000 that was conducted over a 5-year period. The New York State Department of Health decided to have Dr. David Savitz of the University of North Carolina repeat the Wertheimer study. After 5 years, Savitz obtained the same results as Wertheimer. He reported that 20% of childhood cancers appeared to be produced by exposure to 3 milligauss power frequency magnetic fields. The results of the New York State power lines projects were released in 87. It contained this information, as well as information which indicated that power frequency fields had significant behavioral and central nervous system effects, as well as a stimulating effect on cancer cell growth. For the Public Service Commission, the results of this study were a real embarrassment. The magnetic field at the edge of the right-of-way, ROW, about 50 feet away from the standard 345 kV transmission line, averages 100 milligauss. These lines constitute the bulk of the transmission lines in the United States. If a 3 milligauss standard were applied, the ROW around almost all transmission lines would have to be considerably enlarged. In addition, many of the distribution lines' secondaries generate similar strength fields in adjacent residences, and their power would have to be sufficiently reduced. The Public Service Commission, in a dizzying flight from reality, set a safe level of 100 milligauss, claiming that the public had accepted this level of risk, which was nonsense. The public had not been aware of any risk before these studies became common knowledge, and even after the public was told that, while some risks might be present, further research was necessary. A phase that is repeated in countless areas where the public health is concerned, and the public is endangered by irresponsible, irrational, and power-hungry bureaucrats. The public was never asked if it accepted any such risk. An interesting part of this picture is that the government continually performs studies about the effects of the electromagnetic radiation exposure, discovers negative effects, and then ignores the results and denies the studies were ever done, which might be a further indication that sometime, some way in the past, that the powers could be carefully guided the choice of these frequencies to promote the decimation of the population, that they chose these frequencies were chosen. An interesting thought. In 1986, the Navy entered the picture again. The Office of Naval Research supported an international study called Project Henhouse to study the effects of ELF pulsed fields. In June of 1988, the results of this study were reported at a meeting of the Bioelectrical Magnetic Society. 5 of the 6 laboratories reported that apparently very low level, very low frequency pulsed magnetic fields contribute to increased abnormalities, incidence in early embryonic cheeks. It is clear that magnetic fields as small as 1 milligauss have the potential to produce developmental abnormalities. It appears that only 2 specific functional systems in the organism are primarily influenced by this type of field exposure. These are the brain and the growing tissues of the body, including fetal tissues and cancerous growths. The effects on the brain are mainly functional. For example, behavioral abnormalities, learning disabilities, altered biological cycles, and activation of the stress response system. In growing tissues, field exposure promotes the growth of cancer cells and increases the incidence of developmental defects in newborns. Other cases where authorities have been notified of hazards and taken no action. In the early 1970s, Dr. William Morton of the Oregon Health Science University was asked by the Environmental Protection Agency to look into an excessive incident of adenocarcinoma among residents of a Portland neighborhood that contained an unusual concentration of broadcast towers. The project was expanded to study the relationship between EPA measurements of FM radio fields in Portland and the incidence of several types of cancer found in the same area. A significant relationship was found between field intensity in the FM band and the incidence of non-lymphatic leukemia. The EPA took no action on the report. In 1986, Doctors Anderson and Henderson of the Hawaii Department of Health surveyed Honolulu according to consensus track areas. They found that 8 out of every 9 areas containing broadcast towers, that in 8 of them, the incidence of cancer of all types was significantly higher than in adjacent census tracts. They did not have these broadcast towers. No action has been taken in the state of Hawaii. I'm sure it still hasn't. Modulation is the secret. All of the above reports deal with electromagnetic fields at opposite ends of the non-ionizing portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. The power frequency fields oscillate at less than 100 cycles per second. While the microwave oscillates much faster, it is apparent now that these types of biological effects that are associated with each are virtually identical. Modulation is the secret of transmitting information by means of electromagnetic fields. In microwaves, the high-frequency signal is modulated at low frequencies. Microwaves that are unmodulated have no such effect. The 2 types of modulation that are biologically important are pulse modulation and amplitude modulation. In AM radio, for example, the radio receiver demodulates the signal, removing the carrier radio wave frequency, which preserves the modulation that we perceive as voice and music. It appears that the human body can also demodulate the signal when exposed to modulated radio frequency, or microwave fields. The biological effect is that the low frequency vibration. All biological effects from the electromagnetic radiation are produced by ELF frequencies. The body systems that pick up the electromagnetic signal are tuned to the natural frequencies between 0 Hz and 30 Hz. These systems will sense normal fields that are close to this range, between 30 Hz and 500 Hz. The systems then produce an abnormal effect. Microwave radar pulsed at 50 Hz would have the same biological effect as a 60 Hz field alone, which explains the identical effects seen at ELF and microwave frequencies. It also indicates that all intervening frequencies, VLF, AM radio, FM radio, and television, will have the same biological effect. Generally speaking, the biological effects from all man-made electromagnetic fields could be categorized as followed. Effects on growing cells, such as increases in the rate of cancer cell division, increase in the incidence of certain cancers, developmental abnormalities in embryos, alterations in neurochemicals resulting in behavioral abnormalities, such as suicide and depression, alterations in biological cycles, stress responses leading to depression in the human immune system, alterations in learning ability. According to studies done at the University of Chicago by Dr. Samuel Epstein, since 1975, there have been the following increases in the incidences of specific types of cancer: lymphoma, myeloma, melanoma, 100%, breast cancer, 31%, testicular cancer, 97%, pancreatic, 20%, kidney cancer, 142%, colon cancer, 63%. These increases parallel the increases in ambient electromagnetic field in the past 10 to 15 years, and might also relate to the increase in type and quantity of chemicals added to food, water, and environment. The medical monopoly is literally making a killing, and nothing is being done to curb this insane approach by people who manage human society. Very interesting. This is kind of the stuff that got me into Raymond Rife's work. Report on static and time varying electromagnetic fields. In 1987, the World Health Organization and the International Radiological Protection Association completed a 10-year study that included a committee of experts from 13 countries. The 1987 report concluded that there is an urgent need for research to resolve the suspected link between very weak ELF fields and cancer. The report states that the suspected carcinogenic effects of ELF magnetic fields occurs at 0.1 to 1 UT, which is near to extrapolations of an onset threshold based on the work of Savitz, Wertheimer, and Lepper, as we previously discussed. Here are some references for anybody interested. There they are again. Non-technical references available to the public that document non-thermal effects from RF and microwave radiation and low-level magnetic fields. As you can see here, Electromagnetic Man from 1989. Cross Currents, The Perils of Electropollution from 1990. Zapping of America Microwaves, Their Deadly Risks, and the Cover-Up, 1977. The Body Electric, Electromagnetism and the Foundation of Life, by Robert O. Becker. He had some pretty cool devices, I think. I like his. I think he was the one who had the bioelectrifier. I've used that one. Used many experimental electromagnetic devices. Effects of ELF, ULF on biosystems. ELF fields are extremely low frequency magnetic fields with a range of 1 to 100 cycles per second that can affect biological systems. In spite of their weak power, 2 to 10 to the negative 9 Tesla per second, compared with a horseshoe magnet, which is zero point 0.1 Tesla per second, they are capable of affecting the human biological system in a most profound way. Human effects of ELF ULF. In the presence of the protein kinases in the nuclei of the cell, the ELF interacts with the DNA molecule itself. It can turn on or turn off any gene once the correct frequency is known. For example, one frequency can cause cancer in a rat in 2 days. Another can reverse the process. One frequency can cause depression in humans by causing the release of cholinergic neuropeptides in the brain. Still another frequency can cause anxiety. A third can motivate mob behavior, and so forth. It can be done from any point on the planet. The foundation of how ELF can do what it does is that external magnetic fields can control biological spin and proton coupling constants in DNA, RNA, RNA transferases, and hydrons. U.S. Navy results of ELF tests. According to the U.S. Navy, which conducted secret testing for several years, partial results were released in August of '84. The following effects of ELF have been produced in numerous laboratory tests repeatedly: alteration of the behavior of cells, tissue, organs, and organisms, alteration of hormone levels, alteration of cellular chemistry, alteration of time perception in animals and humans, induction of sleep in animals, inhibition or enhancement of bone growth, inhibition or enhancement of cell differentiation, inhibition or enhancement of protein kinase production, inhibition or enhancement of mRNA synthesis processes, alteration of the human immune system process, alteration of the calcium bonding and efflux in cells, destruction and rupture of cellular structure, entrainment of human and animal brain waves, entrainment of the DNA transaction process, cause defects and alteration in embryos, cause alterated fetal mortality rates, cause sterility, promote non-invasive genetic engineering by causing the production of auto-adjusting antibodies that will cause the generation of viruses within the body. Cure of diseases by alteration of cellular frequencies. Additional ELF capabilities. Much of the work on ultra-low frequencies was done and continues to be done by the Navy and Dr. Jose Delgado in Spain, and has produced an additional list of capabilities that are in the hands of the military and intelligence agencies. Creation of fatigued states. Creation of a state of depression. Creation of cataracts and eye problems. Creation of irritability and anger states. General alteration of moods. Creation of compulsive behavior patterns. creation of states of sexual aggressiveness, creation of havoc in circadian rhythms, creation of fear and disorientation, creation of sleep disorders and insomnia. May have already read that. Creation periods of short and long-term memory loss, creation of leukemia and cancer, creation of catatonic zombie-like states, creation of violent states, and criminal behavioral patterns. Funding for military research into DNA absorption of microwaves. In 1986, the U.S. Air Force funded a project costing over $120,000 at King's College London. The project was run by Professor Edward Grant and had to do with the effects of microwaves on human DNA. Much of the U.S. work on DNA absorption is being funded by the U.S. Navy, while British and Swedish research contracts on the subject are paid for by the U.S. Air Force. Areas of existing ELF usage. Natural ELFs. Natural ELF waves are produced by the Earth's micropulsations, including vortex intersection pulses at the intersection of ley lines and geological tectonic fault pulses. The natural pulse of the Earth is the Schumann resonance frequency of 7.85 cycles per second. The natural pulses of the Earth are not electromagnetic waves. They are asymmetric harmonic pulsations of the geomagnetic field. Artificial ELFs, as opposed to natural ELFs. Artificial ELFs are created by man-made electromagnetic grid, which consists of power lines, industrial electric sources, appliances, etc. The penetrating power of these ELF waves is directly proportional to their amplitude, voltage, and power. They decrease in power attenuate inversely as the square of the distance from the source. They do not carry programmed information. At least the ELFs don't. Tactical ELFs. Tactical ELFs waves are created by television, radio, communication, radar, microwave, cellular, telephones, and the like. The power range is usually in the megawatt, millions of cycles per second, or gigawatt, billions of cycles per second. These ELFs, magnetic components of the transmissions, do carry information and are modulated at 16 to 20 hertz and at classified modulation rates. Carriers are very often in the FM range, 147 to 160 megahertz, but also in other frequencies not generally known to the public. Both the type of modulation and the fact that frequency hopping occurs is not generally known to the public. These magnetic waves can penetrate anything. Attempts to stop the waves using Faraday cages have been unsuccessful. A possible solution is to create a neutralizing pulsing magnetic field to counteract the pulsing magnetic fields comprising the ELF, i.e. a Rife machine, essentially. Based on the above information and our research on the matter, it is concluded that the chemical and germ warfare proposed by Colonel Tom Berden was not the real threat to the American public from the Russians. The real threat was in the tactical ELF emanations from the Russians and the United States government. Research appears to indicate that the phenomenology of ELFs and scalar wave technology is almost identical. We know that Colonel Bearden's technical information is correct, but his emphasis against the Russians is orchestrated disinformation. It is the United States military and the intelligence community that is now forcing the issue of electronic mind control and on on an unsuspecting people. The military, 10 milliwatt for 2 square centimeter standard, and the cover up. The electromagnetic capabilities of the military, because of the tri-service program and the work of Professor Schwann, were designed around the 10 milliwatt per square centimeter standard, and once in place, it had to be defended against the discovery of non-thermal biological effects. The recognition and validation of these effects would mean the collapse of the entire military and industrial electromagnetic capabilities of command, control, and communications. It quickly became apparent that evidence for non-thermal effects was viewed as a threat to national security. This view led to the policy of denying any non-thermal effect from any electromagnetic usage, whether military or civilian. Control over the scientific establishment was maintained by allocating research funds in such a way as to ensure that only approved projects that would not challenge the thermal effects standards would be undertaken. Science as a field has always been a bit reactionary, and this tendency was capitalized upon by the military by enlisting the support of prominent members of the engineering and biological professions to support this deception. In some instances, the scientists have been told that non thermal effects did occur, but that national security objectives required that they be hidden from public knowledge. The personal goals of many scientists were subverted by promises of unlimited funding from the military and easy access under classified programs to scientific literature not made available to the public or mainstream scientists. Because of this conclusion, when serious challenges to the thermal effects standards were raised publicly, eminent scientific boards, associations, or foundations were provided with lucrative contracts to evaluate the state of knowledge of the bioeffects of electromagnetic fields. These investigations resulted in the production of voluminous reports. The practice is still going on. All these reports seem to share certain characteristics. Scientific data indicating non-thermal bioeffects is either ignored or subjected to extensive and destructive review. Scientists, even Nobel Prize nominees who reported the existence of non-thermal effects, were ridiculed and were portrayed as being outside the mainstream of thought. Actual disinformation was used to create a false impression. For example, while a statement such as there is no evidence for any effects of pulsed magnetic fields on humans might be true for the person making the statement, data reporting such effects on animals would be ignored, and tests on humans would never be sanctioned through regular scientific channels, but would be performed under the scrutiny of DARPA or covert scientific groups having close connections with the Navy or intelligence factions, who would be conducting such research for nefarious purposes. Notice the parallels in the methodology of this cover up with what has been happening in the areas of UFOs and alien interaction, even now. And what, 30 years later? Locally, when a microwave tower for cellular telephone service was proposed for this area, many of us who had technical backgrounds got together and did research to back up the fact that non-thermal effects do occur. Predictably, the cellular company dragged out a group of manufactured experts, including Arthur Guy, who had retired, to plead their case. They did not expect to encounter our group, who collectively has an immense body of knowledge about all of this information. We stunned the opposition by demonstrating a level of scientific knowledge that they did not expect. They expected a bunch of whining people steeped in social consciousness, but what they got was something else. The the hearings examiner took 6 months to review all the data and decided that we had won this scientifically, but that to acknowledge a win for us on that basis would cause a large problem for the entire cellular industry. So he turned the entire issue over and threw out the scientific aspect and cited elements within Washington state law that would allow them to put up the tower. We lost, but we really had them worried. Other groups in the state are also doing the same thing about the towers in their areas. You will understand the depth of why the cellular companies were so concerned when we get into part 2 of this chapter. The Ground Wave Emergency Network, GWIN system. The Ground Wave Emergency Network, GWIN, is a communication system that the military is in the process of constructing as we speak. It operates in a very low frequency VLF range with transmissions between 150 and 175 kilohertz. This range was selected because its signals travel by means of waves that have a tendency to hug the ground rather than by radiating into the atmosphere. This signal drops off sharply with distance. A single GWIN station transmits a 360 circle to a distance of 250 to 300 miles. The entire GWIN system consists of approximately 300 such stations spread across the United States, each with a tower 350 feet, well, 300 to 500 feet high. The stations are from 200 to 250 miles apart, so that a signal can go from coast to coast from one station to another. When the system is completed in around 1993, the entire civilized population of the United States will be exposed to GWIN transmission. Here is a diagram of electromagnetic RF grids across the USA, including mobile units, microwaves, and our ELF ULFs. I'm sure it's nothing compared to what we have now. The ELF microwave grid across 8 powerful secret transmitters in the United States. That would be the GWIN system. Application of military frequency weaponry. According to a 1982 Air Force review of biotechnology, ELF has a number of potential military uses, including dealing with terrorist groups, crowd control, controlling breaches of security at military installations, and anti-personnel techniques in tactical warfare, the same report states. Electromagnetic systems would be used to produce mild to severe physiological disruption or perceptual distortion or disorientation. They are silent, and countermeasures to them may be difficult to develop. Between 1980 and 1984, I was in England and I got to see some illustrations of how some of this technology actually works. During this period, there were a lot of protests, sit ins, demonstrations by Greenpeace and many other groups against the deployment of cruise missiles, especially at Greenham Common, which was south of where I was located in 83 and 84. There was a very large presence of military police at the base when the cruise missiles arrived. Around mid 84, the presence diminished considerably, and some of the protesters who were outside the base started claiming that they were being irradiated from the base because of the physical problems they were unable to link to any other source. This was reported in Electronics Day magazine in 1985. The symptoms ranged from skin burns to headaches to drowsiness to menstrual bleeding at abnormal times, bouts of temporary paralysis, faulty speech coordination, and in one case, circulatory failure severe enough to require hospitalization. Such a complex series of symptoms fit well with severe electromagnetic field exposure. The Ministry of Defense denied that any harmful electromagnetic signal was being used against the woman, but did not deny that an electromagnetic signal may be in use, which, if below 10 milliwatts per 2 square per square centimeter, would not, under UK guidelines, be officially acknowledged as harmful. In other words, they just lied. A short inventory of frequency weapons listed in the British Defence Equipment Catalogue. The photic driver, a glorified strobe light which emits pulses in the critical range of 10 to 30 hertz. The Valkyrie, an enhanced device for the photic driver that will deliver sound pulses in the 4 to 7.5 hertz range. The Sound Girdler, a sound output system of 350 watts that is guaranteed to repel a crowd. Cases of deliberate experimentation on individuals for military purposes. In one study, over 100 Washington and Oregon state prisoners. Recall the discussion on phase 2 drug testing in chapter 5. Yeah, we skipped that part for good reason. Between 1963 and 71, had their testicles dosed with radiation to discover what doses would sterilize them. The project was funded by the Atomic Energy Commission at a cost of $1.5 million. From 1945 to 1947, 18 hospital patients, one of them only 5 years old, were injected with plutonium to measure how much the body would retain. The injections were represented as experimental treatments for the patients' illnesses. This appalling scheme was reviewed in the British Medical Journal in 1987, where it was said that the redeeming feature of the test was that the results were made available to other countries for their use. How generous of them. Well, I think that might be enough for you to sleep on. And I need a break. I believe we'll carry on with the psychology behind mind control and psychic warfare next. And another exciting episode in this series going over the Matrix books by Valdemar Valerian. Check them out. These are interesting materials for your coffee tables. Thank you for joining me. If you like this material, please give me a like. Let me know what you think. If you have any more information, share it. It's all in good fun. And I don't know if any of this is true. You might have to check, or I might just have to say that. Well, thank you. Have a great day or night. Bye.